Jonathan, thanks for joining me for this conversation about NFTs. We're thankful to have you be a part of NFT NYC this year. Can you please introduce yourself and Protocol Labs to me?
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Jonathan Victor. I work on IPFS and Filecoin, specifically looking at applications for NFTs. Protocol Labs, we're a research development and deployment lab. We build open source protocols to power the decentralized web.
As you've been developing from beginning to now, what's the process been for cultivating community, both internally with your team, your strategic partners, and how is that different for cultivating community externally with those that you're impacting?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing about the Web3 ecosystem is everything actually is about community. Like all the tools that we build are open source. For us, the way that we sort of view this is, especially when we think about what are the technological primitives we want for the future of the internet, we need something that's owned by people and not by like institutions or individuals. And so really, as you're trying to build these things that can operate at humanity scale, you need it to be a collaborative effort. And so we think really deeply both about how do you build protocols that can be broken off from each other? So if people want only bits and pieces, how do they take the parts that make sense for them? How do you make it easy for people to contribute? How do you align incentives so you can give people the resources that they need in order to be able to build in that ecosystem? And so for us, like we've been trying to massively ramp and really expand that sort of like resourcing pipeline as well, and get to like thousands of developers that are building in our ecosystem. Yeah.
Maybe you could talk a bit about what you're coming to share at NFT NYC, give people a bit of a preview on.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things that we've sort of talked about, NFTs have sort of had their moment in 2021, and it's been building for many, many years. And I think really it now starts asking the questions as we've sort of sparked the imagination of Web 2. We're thinking of like gaming, we're talking about like bearer assets, whether it be tickets or other physical things that can be moved to the digital realm. And then when you start thinking about those questions, you really start having to probe at the other underlying technologies of NFTs, asking how do we actually make technologies that can store billions of NFTs worth of data? And how do we do that in a way that's cost effective? How do we make it resilient? Really starting to think about these protocols are no longer experiments. What we want is to make it such that this can actually work at web scale. And that's the technologies that we work on. So I'll be talking about how you can use IPFS and Filecoin to really power like the next billion NFTs that are going to exist.
When you talk about the technology, there's obviously a difference when you talk to technical people, right? You keep it detail oriented and the deep specifics, and new people that you're just trying to like draw them into this different climate. How do you have these discussions around technology if they're kind of in the know or if it's a new, it's a whole new paradigm?
Yeah, I think it's like, it's always best, especially if you're working with less technical people, to use analogies, things that people can sort of relate to, come up with examples. Like when I talk to folks about like NFTs as like a utility, sometimes I'll use the example of like, we all have these vaccine cards, especially in New York. And so like, that's something that there was a huge conversation about like, oh, which tech company is going to build this? How are we going to maintain privacy? And when you have this digital infrastructure, you have a new potential operating model. And so giving people a tangible example of like, what could an NFT be used for outside of just the art context? When I talk to technical folks, really it starts probing into the deeper questions where even if they're a developer, they may not have thought about what are the implications of certain choices. If I pick a specific protocol for how I store my NFT, am I locking myself into future risk down the line? If that storage protocol potentially has an issue, how do I make sure that my NFT won't break? And so really thinking deeply about what are the technical choices that are sort of implicitly being made, and how do you make it really easy for folks to take advantage of best practices?
When you think about the future, not to predict or be a prophet, unless you are a prophet, but when you think about it in terms of just hope, right? Building toward, like what are you projecting would be the ideal outcome? If I say NFT 2024, what comes to mind in terms of development in the next 2 or 3 years?
I think for me, one of the most exciting things, hopefully this is something that lands in 2022, is really on the gaming front. I think when we think about how do we bring the next 100 million users into crypto, I think there's like several trends that I think most of us would be okay like saying it's like been validated. I think DeFi and DeFi summer was one trend. NFTs this year really hit the mainstream. And I think gaming separately is a multi-$100 billion industry. And especially thinking about these Web2 users and how do you convince them about the value and why it should matter. They're the ones who have lived inside of like a renting economy. And so coupling that with an owner economy, which is Web3, you have the ability to build markets where users can actually invest in assets and then liquidate them if they'd like to exit. And so for me, at least, I think things that Axie is like pioneering, we see Gala Games, other teams that are doing play to earn. I think that's super fascinating, but I think it really expands like the question of like who is a Web3 user. I think slowly we're seeing like that circle expand into like Web2 users. This year it was artists. I think next year it'll be gamers. And then I think as we move down the line, there'll be more and more use cases where NFTs will hopefully become a very boring topic where it's like, here's just a way that you like can do this thing on a public ledger. It'll be obvious to people about what are all the different applications, how can it be used, why would a company who's like a normal Web2 company actually consider doing something like that?
I like that. So when you imagine 5,000 people at NFT NYC, there's a lot of noise, right? It's going to be hard to break through and get a message across. So I often frame it this way. By the way, it's just like, wrapping up the final question because we keep these things short. You have, let's say, 5,000, everyone that has a ticket, they're all in one place. Let's say Times Square. You have all the billboards. What message would you give the community of builders, enthusiasts, investors, those that are already building the industry? What do they need to hear to get them into 2022 and continue to progress?
Yeah, I think the most important thing I would leave people with is we're at like a really interesting inflection point where like Web 2 is streaming into Web 3. And now is the time to really focus on how do we build resilient tools? How do we build things that scale? And how do we make it possible to like really capture the imagination of all of these users who today we have their attention and like really showcase to them the value of all of these things that we're working on, whether it be using Popes for engagement. So when people go to events, whether it be tickets, whether it be bringing new user groups like artists, whether we use NFTs as like fundraising tools for like proof of donation. I think we have so many opportunities here. And I think really leaning into all of these different dimensions and thinking about how we build these things to actually be resilient so that we can last for the next 50, 100 years.
I'm with you. Well, Jonathan, thanks for leaning in with us. Thanks for being a part of our event. Wouldn't be the same without you. And I appreciate you jumping on here. For anybody that's watching us live or sees the archive of this, thank you for your attention. We appreciate it. My name is Ian Utilli. I'm one of the co-producers at NFT NYC, and I always enjoy getting to spend time with the people that make our event happen, the speakers, the sponsors, people like you, Jonathan. So thanks.